Hi everyone, lovely to meet you, you all, and thanks for spending your evening with me. And I hope it's going to be useful for you. And I found a much better photo than the one I had up a minute ago. A little background about me. So my name's Chris. I'm an advanced clinical practitioner in major trauma, a role that I've been doing for just over 5 years. And I currently work in a Peninsular Major Trauma Centre in Plymouth in Devon. I'm a nurse by background, and I've had the pleasure to spend the vast majority of my career working in major trauma, on major trauma wards and across four different major trauma centres. I've worked a variety of roles from staff nurse to major trauma coordinator, trainee ACP, and now ACP. And for the last few years, I've been one of the co-chairs of the National Major Trauma Nursing Group Education Subgroup, which is a bit of a mouthful. And it's given me the opportunity to collaborate with and support major trauma ward nurse educators across the UK. And I'll talk about this a bit later in the presentation. I'm also one of the founders and co-chairs of the National Major Trauma Advanced Practice Group, MTAP, which brings together ACPs working in major trauma services. And one of our goals is to improve education. I've also completed a PG cert during the project, and I'm a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. But the reason I'm really here, though, is that I was invited by Trauma Care, and I'd like to say thank you for this opportunity because of a project I led on while I was working up in Manchester, and I was able to share via publication. So actually, if you prefer, you could just log off now and read it instead. Or if you're happy to stay a while, I'll talk to you about how we developed and evaluated a course for major trauma ward nurses. So why am I interested in trauma education? So I'm passionate about trauma care, particularly in the ward setting. It's where most of our patients spend the majority of their time in hospital. And as clinicians, there's a real opportunity to make a difference to patient outcomes there, which is perfect if you've got any sort of hero complex. Most major trauma patients are highly complex, and those looking after them have to have good knowledge and skills across multiple systems. So it's a really interesting speciality to get your teeth into as an educator. And it's fast paced, and there's always changes and improvements to what we consider being best practice. So in addition to educating, I'm always learning. It's a relatively new focus on post resuscitation or ward level major trauma education for nurses. So it's an exciting area, and it's one I think is going to develop more in the coming years, and presumably one too which you have an interest in if you join tonight. And finally, because education is and always will be essential, so there'll always be plenty of work to do. So we're all here at a major trauma webinar, so I'm sure we're aware of what major trauma is and how significant it can be on the people that sustain it and their wider networks. There are some international differences, and I know we've got some people from different countries on here in the classification of major trauma. In the UK, the trauma networks were established to treat patients with ISS 9 or above, or polytrauma, and it's estimated that 45,000 people annually sustain major trauma in the UK. And historically, a lot of the focus on major trauma education has always been at the front door in the emergency department or pre-hospital settings and managing patients within that golden hour. But we know that it doesn't stop at the front door. We know that this group of patients have a prolonged hospital stay for both acute management and for rehabilitation, and they tend to be on wards and in major trauma centres and trauma units. It's currently a national recommendation that major trauma centres have a major trauma ward, and an increasing amount of MTCs now cohort their patients in this way. And quite a few years ago now, the National Major Trauma Nursing Group, which again I'll come back to, launched a set of competencies which nurses working with major trauma patients on wards were expected to evidence. And these are included in the QSIS standards for peer review, and networks are expected to evidence that their nurses have achieved or are working towards these competencies. However, since the launch of the competencies, there have been challenges across the country in supporting nurses to achieve and evidence these competencies. And there's a lot of variations in network of how this is done, and anecdotally, low levels of completion have been reported. So I said I'd come back to it. The National Major Trauma Nursing Group, it's a brilliant group. And if you're UK based and a nurse working in major trauma, and that's at any setting and any level, I'd encourage you to get involved. And I've seen some of the names on the chat, so I know some of you are already involved. There are multiple subgroups, and it's a great chance to network, collaborate, and get involved in national projects. And you can join and learn more about the group on the website on the slide there. And the National Major Trauma Nursing Group and National Major Trauma Rehab Group have published a number of competency frameworks over the years, in a number of major trauma settings, including ED, ward, rehab, pediatric. And the one that's most applicable to this talk is the ward competencies, which this project was built around. It's a 41-page long but really useful document, and I would encourage anyone looking at developing nursing education inside or outside the UK to take a look. And I've tried to summarize it a bit further in the next slides. And I also wanted to mention some of the other work that the National Major Trauma Nursing Group supports for nurse education. The group peer reviews courses aimed at ED nurses for quality and content and keeps a national record. It also offers peer support for educators and nurses alike and a platform to share experiences. And finally, there's an amazing project ongoing to develop open access e-learning for nurses across the UK. And they've already got a few brilliant modules and there's a lot more to come. So please have a look at the website. Right. This is an intentionally busy slide, but these are each of the individual sections of the National Major Trauma Nursing Competency or Capability Framework. From now on, if it's okay, I'll just refer to it as the Capability Framework. So you can see there are 20 in total, and they cover a range of aspects from organizational aspects to individual body systems, such as thoracic, musculoskeletal, to special groups, and then overarching concepts such as pain management. And this is a snippet of the thoracic section of the national framework itself. It's not massively clear, I'm sorry, but you can see that each area is broken down into details of what the nurse should be able to describe, understand, or demonstrate, depending on the specific area. And there are boxes on there to include evidence such as CPD, work-based assessment, and self-assessment. You might note some of the elements on this one, such as massive hemothorax and tension pneumothorax, are some of the big things we see in major trauma. And I'll come back to that a bit later about some of the more regular things that we see and how they fit into the framework too. So anyway, that's probably enough background. So sit tight, get comfortable, and I'll tell you our story. So for this, we're going to go all the way back to 2020 and in Manchester, a very different world. So where were we up to in Manchester in 2020? We had a major reconfiguration in 2019. We opened a major trauma ward and we expanded our service and infrastructure. Lots of nurses came to work on the new major trauma ward from a number of surgical specialties, emergency medicine and intensive care. And in addition, we had newly qualified and international nurses join us. So we were fortunate enough to be able to provide these nurses with some basic trauma education as we prepared to open the ward. But other than that, we were mainly sending them on external courses aimed at emergency department nurses. The nurses really enjoyed these courses and they offer brilliant exposure to that initial resuscitation, but they weren't designed for ward nurses and the ongoing care. And access to these courses has always been challenging due to shortage of spaces, cost, and often the need to travel. So we identified the need to support education for the major trauma ward nurses in December 2020, and I took on the nurse education lead role alongside my ACP role. And the brief was to improve education and support completion of the national framework at our trust. And at this stage, only none of our nurses could demonstrate competency, although several of them had completed lots of courses and were really highly skilled. It seemed like we had a big mountain to climb, and at that stage, I wasn't quite sure where to start. And this probably feels like a long time ago now too. But looking back, I realized that the COVID pandemic had a huge impact on our project and our service, as it did on health services and on people across the world. So for us, it brought multiple challenges. Our ward was moved several times, staff were redeployed, and others left the NHS. Sickness and self-isolation levels were high, and that meant less access to study leave, and we were unable to access the previously mentioned national courses we'd used before. In a way, though, it was also the spark that caused us to really develop this education program, as now we had no option but to look within our own service to develop and support the nurses' education during that time. And we were clear from the beginning that we were not going to stop education during this time. As I said earlier, it is and always will be essential. So where to start? So the first thing I did was ask the nurses what they thought they needed to support their education. We created and distributed an anonymous survey to all the nurses on the ward, which was 20 nurses, and 18 of them responded. We asked them to self-rate their competence against some key themes from the National Major Trauma Nursing Group framework, using a scale of 1 to 10, So with one being not competent and 10 being competent against the statements. We also asked them to self-rate their confidence in some key clinical skills with a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being not confident and 5 being confident or able to manage independently. And these key clinical skills included things like chest strain, traction, spinal column, uh, stomach care, GCS assessment, insertion of airway adjuncts. And then we also asked them how they thought that major trauma education could be improved for them and how they'd like it to look. And the results of the initial survey, which are down at the bottom in blue, demonstrated moderate self-rated competency across the areas, so a mean of 5.5 out of 10, and variable clinical skills confidence. So it's high in some areas that were done regularly, such as GCS assessment, and then lower in others, such as ex-fix care. And the nurses' suggestions for education revealed a preference for face-to-face teaching with practical elements and recording the sessions to allow people to re-review the teaching. They also suggested support to develop and evidence their competencies. So what next? We then looked at what in-house provision we already had at the trust. I suppose we were wondering, did we need to do anything? Or did all the elements that we needed to meet the capability framework already exist in our trust? We just needed to compile them. So we looked at mandatory training such as BLS and ILS, spinal brace training, for example. We laid out all the pages, all 41 of the capability framework, and took post-it notes of all the education provision that we already had and mapped it against to see how much of it was covered. And unfortunately, it wasn't much. We also spoke to other major trauma centres and members of the National Major Trauma Nursing Group, found out what they were doing and what had worked for them. And finally, we looked at other courses which we could send the nurses on and whether they would meet their needs. We found these to be limited at that stage due to the pandemic, and courses were either online, so they lacked the practical elements that we wanted to include and the nurses had asked us for, or they were focused on the reception phase of care, such as those that I discussed earlier. And they have transferable elements, but didn't meet all our criteria. There was also a cost element to the courses, and we didn't have a budget for providing this education. So we listened to our nurses and we gave them what they'd asked for. We started to design a bespoke in-house trauma course mapped to the national framework and to the identified needs of our nurses from the survey results. We called it TRACS, which stood for Trauma Care Knowledge and Skills, and here's the logo we created too. We also recognize that attendance on a course doesn't equal competence. Competence is an integrative term, and it could be defined as comprising of skills, knowledge, experience, professional judgment, and values. And therefore, we felt that that would need multi-dimensional evidence to show it. So with that in mind, we wanted to provide support to the nurses to create portfolios to display their evidence. And I'll talk about this in a couple of slides. So we'll start with the course. We set about designing the track syllabus first, and it quickly became clear that we would have to simplify things to fit it into a course, and also to get our heads around the framework. So firstly, we grouped the National Major Trauma Nursing Group framework into 13 key topics, which would then be delivered in taught sessions. And you can see how we did this in the top right of the slide. We did this for efficiency in some aspects, such as airway, breathing, circulation, etc., fitted nicely together as an A to E assessment. And that special groups also seem to be logical together. And then we looked at which elements seemed essential to include in a taught course and which ones could be included in a workbook or video lectures. We decided to have pregnancy and bariatric trauma as video lectures as they were less commonly seen in our centre. And then that'll allow us more time for the other subjects, some of which were really big, like, for example, traumatic brain injury, musculoskeletal. We then looked at identifying educators within the trust, and we found people who were experts in their field. And these included people like consultants, specialist nurses, specialist AHPs, sorry, allied health professionals, and ACPs and ANPs. These educators were all given a copy of the appropriate section of the framework, and also learning outcomes, which were developed for the topic to guide their teaching. And ensure we addressed all the theoretical elements. So at the bottom right, there's a snippet from the thoracic trauma learning outcomes we developed. We also added some areas of the learning outcomes that were specific to our service so that we saw more of. For example, we included more penetrating trauma, as this was something we saw a lot of. And we also added some elements that were not kind of so much your emergency management, such as management of a traumatic pneumothorax, as well as tension pneumothorax and management of a hemothorax. We also removed some elements of the framework that we didn't see in our service. So, for example, we didn't have tracheostomies on our major trauma ward, so we took out the tracheostomy care section. And that's one of the great things about the national framework, that it's made that elements can be removed if they're not appropriate to your service. So it should be personalizable to each centre and each trust. And then we reviewed all the sessions against the learning outcomes again to check they were covered. It was also important to us that the course was free to the nurses and off the ward to reduce barriers to attendance and nurses being called back into clinical duties. And that was agreed via service line management to ensure we had appropriate cover for the ward during the study days. We had the course assessed by our Trust CPD scheme. It was assigned 10 CPD points, which nurses could use for their NMC revalidation. And we also shared our journey as we went via hospital newsletters, social media, conferences, and that meant that we could constantly evaluate our challenges and successes and discuss these with others as we went along, which helped us maintain awareness of and commitment to the course from our trust. And the actual course was developed to be a mix of taught theoretical sessions and practical elements. We also include a flipped classroom approach for some elements. So we provided workbooks and video lectures to the nurses, and then time and space to discuss these during the day. An example of where they did this was for pregnancy trauma. These pictures on the right are from some of our courses, and the days were split between clinical teaching areas and lecture theatres. The practical elements included formative simulation. Um, we were really keen that this was a safe space for the nurses to practice, learn, and discuss their knowledge and skills rather than an assessment. We tried to make this realistic for unwell patients in the ward setting. So we included patients, for example, who had a brain injury and then had a seizure, um, patients who had a displaced chest drain, or a patient that was found on the floor. We also included clinical skills teaching, such as collar fitting, GCS assessment, and airway adjunct insertion. And we set up skills stations that nurses could rotate between. We also included these key skills in the sim sessions. We recorded the sessions so they could be rewatched to consolidate learning, which the nurses had asked for, and included other supplementary videos, which we kept on our course YouTube channel. And here you can see a sample program of one of the courses. Again, it's quite small. I'm sorry, there's the red underline on there. Um, but you can see that the 2 days were jam-packed with sessions. It was really fast-paced, and the cohort was split into smaller groups for sim and clinical skills. And they also had the opportunity to practice the skill stations during the breaks. So they were long days, but a lot of fun, and usually came with a generous helping of both tea and biscuits. Sorry. So we held the course at 6 monthly intervals, and afterwards we asked all nurses attending to repeat the survey following the courses, so we could evaluate and adapt to the feedback as we went. And then we compiled the data that I'm presenting here after the third course, which was in May 2022. So over the 3 courses, we had 30 nurses attending, which included all nurses working on our major trauma ward and some from other wards that regularly saw major trauma. And we found that the nurses that were attending the course were generally junior, with over 3 quarters having less than 2 years clinical experience. Quite a lot were newly qualified. Of those that had worked in other areas, the most common areas were orthopedics, critical care, and emergency medicine. And we discovered that 10% had completed a nationally available course. So that includes some of the ones, the reception phase ones we discussed earlier, and some of the available online courses. And we were pleased to note that 100% all our nurses said that they would recommend the course to our colleagues, and many wanted to repeat it at regular intervals. And this graph shows some of the feedback. It shows the pooled pre and post results from the course evaluation. And it shows an improvement in the nurse's mean self-rated competence across each area of the capability framework that we asked about. The biggest percentage increases were in circulation, which included major hemorrhage management and max fax trauma. And this graph shows the nurse's mean self-rated confidence against some key clinical skills included in the course. It is a sample of 10 nurses, which is only from one course. And that's as we hadn't included all the elements for the key clinical skills in all the evaluations, so we couldn't get a full sample. Again, it shows an improvement in confidence in all the key clinical skills, with interestingly the highest improvement being the airway adjunct section, so insertion of NP and OP airways. And we also collected some qualitative feedback from the course. Some of the samples of the positive and constructive feedback we received is included here. So generally, the nurses felt that the course was beneficial to improve their knowledge and confidence across specialities and body systems. And people appreciated having the sim element included. We also received feedback about the course being very fast paced and the lack of breaks, which was understandable as we tried to fit a lot in. And as we developed the courses, we tried to keep this in mind. And at the later courses, we moved some of the elements to video lectures and tried to make some of the clinical skills stations optional for people that were already experienced, which improved the pace in the latest course. And so the second and key element of our program that I mentioned earlier was the portfolio. We felt strongly that attendance on a course alone isn't enough to evidence competency, and that most nurses should be keeping a record of their knowledge, skills, and achievements. Most nurses keep portfolios, and I know this is expected by the NMC, but I'm slightly ashamed to say that when I became an AC, it was only when I became an ACP that I realized the true potential of my portfolio as an opportunity to present myself as a nurse throughout my career and not just somewhere to keep a pile of certificates. So we were keen that we used a portfolio approach to evidencing competency so that the nurses could then retain ownership of their development and that this portfolio could travel with them and develop throughout their career. So the vision for the portfolio was that it would be a useful and meaningful process for the individuals. And the nurses had indicated in their initial survey that they wanted support to evidence this competency. Another aspect I've experienced as an ACP is regular clinical supervision. And this was something I hadn't encountered until I became an ACP. From speaking to other nurses, this seems to be the experience many nurses have, with this kind of support limited to once a year for appraisal, or during preceptorship when newly qualified, or in mentorship for student nurses. So we were keen to offer focused support for the individual and for their professional development and to develop the portfolio. And we felt that a coaching approach was the best fit as it's time limited and to some degree it's task focused. So we paired each nurse with a senior colleague who had either a qualification in mentorship or coaching and had been working in the major trauma service. Each coach was assigned between 4 to 8 nurses to work with, and they were supplied with a pack explaining the role and expectations to the portfolio, and we all met together to discuss our goals as coaches. And they also worked closely together to provide peer support to each other. So the nurses were all given an initial meeting with their coach, which lasted about an hour, and that was to map their existing evidence, knowledge, skills, and experience against the national framework. Their individual goals and career aspirations were discussed, and a professional development plan was formulated. The nurse and their coach then met at an agreed frequency, which was usually monthly, to discuss their portfolio development and the PDP. And the whole process was expected to take between 6 to 12 months, but that was dependent on the individual's needs. And we hoped this through this process, the nurses' intrinsic motivation to create their portfolio would be increased as they were invested in the process and it was linked to their own development rather than just a process to tick boxes. So what did the portfolio look like? Well, it looked like whatever the nurses wanted it to. So some were paper, some were electronic, some were fat, some were thin, some were pink, one was covered in glitter. Um, Nurses created and collated bundles of evidence that could be used to demonstrate their knowledge and skills against sections of the framework. And the types of evidence each nurse included was unique to them. And nurses were encouraged to utilize a range of different evidence sources. And that included some of the examples here. So your course certificates that my early portfolio was full of, records of e-learning and video and podcast summaries, clinical skills sign-offs, case studies of interesting patients, or reflections of interesting patients, or when perhaps something had gone well or not so well. Presentations and teaching that they're given unto other people, and learning summaries of book chapters they read, and also some of our coaching discussions. And then there was a number of workbooks that we'd also developed to support them, and the completed workbooks were also often included. And then the bundles of evidence that the nurses created could then be used against multiple sections of the framework. So it was encouraged that evidence was triangulated. And again, to demonstrate the depth and breadth of their learning and understanding for each element. So an example of this would be that for chest drain management, a nurse's evidence bundle might include a certificate of attendance at a course, such as tracks, observation of practical skills form, which is similar to a medical DOPS form, so potentially of them removing a chest drain or giving chest drain care, and maybe a reflection about an occasion when there was a chest drain related emergency. And then over the nurse's career, they may then choose to add more evidence to the bundle and therefore show continuing learning and development. And once the nurse had collated enough evidence against each outcome in the framework, the coach and the nurse met to review the portfolio as a whole, and to discuss their development over the course of the coaching period and their plans for the future. And then the nurse's portfolio was signed off and a certificate provided, and the nurse's competence was logged in their staff record. And nurses who had completed the coaching development program were sent an anonymous survey to evaluate the program. At the time of data collection, 5 nurses had completed, and that was due to the time that the process actually took. They were asked to rate their satisfaction and how useful they found it on a 10-point scale, and also asked to rate their motivation to produce the portfolio at the beginning of the process and its completion using a 5-point scale. They were then asked for written feedback after every rating, and their quality of responses were thematically analysed. So they reported mean satisfaction and usefulness scores of 9.8 out of 10, which we're really pleased with. And motivation scores increased from 3.4 to 4.8 out of 5 during the process. All the respondents felt that their knowledge and skills had improved as a result, and all of them said that they'd recommend it to a colleague. And during the thematic analysis, 3 main themes emerged. They were individualized approach, personal growth, and professional growth. So the nurses reported that they appreciated having time for the one-to-one coaching, that they enjoyed being listened to and given the opportunity to develop goals and to develop their own journey. They reported a change of perception in themselves as a nurse through the process, an appreciation of their value as a member of the MDT, increased pride in their role as a major trauma nurse. And they also valued the opportunity for professional development, for example, enhancing their clinical skills, their CV, or developing their career. And we're really, really pleased to report that several of the nurses went on to attain promotions following doing the program. And of course, it wasn't all plain sailing and positive feedback. We encountered a number of challenges over the project, which included different difficulties obtaining operational engagement, and particularly during the pandemic when services and staffing were really stretched. We spent a lot of time discussing the course and competencies with managers, and we managed to secure designated study time for the nurses to attend the courses. But there were still short-term cancellations due to people being required for clinical duties. And the coaching was challenging, as unlike the course, nurses couldn't be rotated off the ward for whole days to complete sessions. So both the nurse and the coach fitted in meetings around their clinical schedules, which meant that they were frequently interrupted and often cancelled or postponed. Nurses were given study time to develop their portfolio, but that was also limited, and it made creating the portfolio a challenge at times. And we introduced designated CPD days trialed for the coaching sessions, which increased participation levels, and that reduced the frequency of the cancelled sessions, but was still difficult to manage. And it was really hard work for the whole team to maintain momentum running the rolling program of courses. All the educators fitted in teaching around their clinical duties, with many doing it in their own time. And I want to thank all those that gave their own time, energy, and enthusiasm to make the courses happen. And particularly to my clinical supervisor and the service lead for Manchester at the time, Stella Smith, who was hugely supportive of nurses education, which was just brilliant to see. And that's the end of us. That's the end of our story for tonight. So looking back over the course, I'm really proud of what we achieved and the feedback we received. And I've really enjoyed leading the project, particularly the coaching element. Um, we noticed a shift in team morale, and the courses were a great opportunity for team building and sharing best practice. And we were fortunate enough to share our successes in the trust network nationally, and now are here. So hope you found it really useful, and perhaps it might be a model that works for your service. Um, Manchester was no longer, by no means, the only service developing courses and programs to develop and support major trauma ward nurses education. And through my work at National Major Trauma Nursing Group, I know of multiple amazing and varied offerings across the nation. So thank you for your time tonight, and thank you again for Trauma Care for the opportunity to present. And please feel free to get in touch. My email's on there, and so is my Twitter tag or X tag if you've got any questions. And there's a few brief references. And then I need to figure out how to get back to Anna.
Don't worry about it. I am here, so I can do this. Ta-da, I can do it for you. And
Thank you.
then I'll just pop my screen back on as per usual, everyone. And hopefully everyone can see that. I'm not going to get shouted at. Yes, continue to share. There we go. Lovely stuff. So, Chris, thank you so much for a fascinating insight and all to the incredible hard work that you've done over the years to develop such a comprehensive course. And hopefully everyone's taken something from this and looks forward to sort of finding something similar, if not that course, with them. So, before we move on to the Q&As, because there are some questions that have come in, which is absolutely lovely to see, I just want to draw everyone's attention to our next webinar, which again, as we always do at Trauma Care, covering everything that we can. We have the webinar is next Thursday, actually, so no rest for the wicked over here after some lovely rest. But our next webinar is going to be next week. Next Thursday, we're joined by Professor Ian Roberts, who's going to be talking to us about TXA in trauma, the wonder drug. And if you looked at our social media today, you could tell that I was having a bit of fun because I put a superhero cape on a bottle of TXA and then flew it in the sky. So do scan the QR code that's on your screen now, and hopefully we will see you next weekend for a lovely change of subject, but still just as relevant as tonight. And then, ta-da! So here is the all-important QR code that you guys need if you are not a member of Trauma Care. As always, if you are a member of Trauma Care, please do not scan this QR code. Do not follow the link that I've just popped into the chat. Please just sit tight until tomorrow and I will send across your CPD certificates first thing. If you are a member of Trauma Care, aren't a member of Trauma Care, follow the link or... and we'd love to see the pink glitter portfolio is in the chat as well. Absolutely fantastic. And so do follow the code that's follow the link that's either in the chat or scan the QR code that's on your screen now, and you can purchase your certificate for £1.99, and that is for non-members of Trauma Care. Now, as promised, straight onto the questions. This screen will stay up as we are talking. So Mark has asked, is this course offered to bank nurses to create capacity?
I'm not on mute, am I? So unfortunately, Tracks I don't think is on offer at all at the minute, because I no longer work in Manchester. I know they are offering courses, but we never offered it externally to the trust. Originally, that had been one of our plans, whether we'd make it a national offering, but we were very keen that it would be free at the point of access, and that's more challenging if you're trying to turn something into a national course. So I don't know the answer, but the tracks course itself, no, unfortunately.
Okay, lovely. But maybe I'll watch this space. Maybe I'm not going to put words into Chris's mouth here, but watch this space. An anonymous attendee, we get a lot of those. An anonymous attendee has put, "Hi Chris, amazing presentation, thank you. I am starting at UHP on the MTW later this year as an NQN. How scary. Is this course something that is offered at UHP and would it be completed?" So it's kind of going on. So I don't know if you know anything that's maybe similar around there, or anything that the NMTNG is doing in that part as well that can offer something similar. So over to you.
Yeah, so well, welcome to UHP. And welcome to the Major Trauma Ward. So yeah, again, the tracks was and the coaching program was a kind of project that I led when I was in Manchester. So they are offering amazing ward education, but so is the team at UHP. They also are offering education on the ground. They've got an educator in place, and there's lots of, like I alluded to, lots of different people are doing lots of little bits nationally as well. The National Major Trauma Nursing Group e-learning will cover a lot of the theoretical elements. There's also the TCAR course that lots of people really go on, and I've done myself. And then, yeah, the plan will be to, at UHP anyway, to run practical sim type elements as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the NMTNG, though you'll know this more, I think were they on the OLAS app at one point as well, or with some courses on there as well. So yeah.
Yep.
Um so lots of things that you can find online and on the NMTNG do amazing work, as do TCAR. And I know Laura is in the chat tonight, so I spotted you earlier. So hello, Laura. Jim Harrison has asked, are there any clinical outcome improvements that have been studied from your training?
No. I just finished there.
There we go. No. No,
No,
but
we
I'm
did.
sure people felt better
Yeah,
for it.
we did looking at patient safety. So we looked at incidents and datexes, and whether there was a reduction in things like, say, incidents around chest drain management. Always talking about thoracic trauma, apologies. But we felt that there was a reduction in datexes, but we didn't have a big enough data set to look at that. I think if you were going to roll this course out for longer, um, and and well, it's really difficult because you've only got a limited amount of people to study. Um, it would be interesting. It would definitely be interesting to look at patient safety type outcomes, and you'd want a reduction in patient safety incidents, really.
Yeah, and I'm sure your teachings created that as well. And another one asking for the course as well. So Kerry's asked, could this potentially be brought for the HCAs on our major trauma ward? That's Kerry Monolly, just in case you know the name.
So yeah, I mean, Tracks itself, the course side of it, was open to HCAs as well, and allied health professionals if they wanted. So it's kind of anyone who wanted to come. In terms of the coaching element, at the minute, the national guidance is for nurses, so registered nurses, to show competence against the capability framework. So that was a focus for the registered nurses. But there's absolutely no reason why everyone who's working with these patients shouldn't obtain, knowledge and skills, and evidence that against the competencies. I think it'd be a very good idea for people to do. And I think the majority of courses should be open to both registered and unregistered staff. But it's just often I think when there's a cost and there's a time kind of element, people tend to focus on the group that that they
Yeah.
need to do for their peer review.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And so that was a very succinct 4 questions that we had in. However, I can guarantee, because it normally always happens, that someone's typing away on their phone at the moment, getting something in. So, and everyone needs a Kerry. Okay. Apparently, I should know Kerry. So, Kerry, I'm very glad to have met you virtually this evening. And hopefully, if I have met you at a course and one of the trauma care things as well, I'm sorry that I don't remember you. But this is your last chance to get any questions in. I'm going to move on and thank and to scan the QR code or scroll up in the chat and find the link. But I'm going to move on and do the usual, which is thank our incredible sponsors as well. So as always, huge thanks to Slater and Gordon, our premium sponsors, but not forgetting our wonderful first aid sponsors, QualSafe. I'm wearing the t-shirt tonight, as I do every single week. So to Toby, Nigel, and the whole gang over at QualSafe, thank you so much for your support, for putting on all the first aid streams that we do. We've got some exciting collaborative stuff coming up with QualSafe actually, so watch this space. But if you want to find out more about what they do, the courses that they have available now, do go to qualsafe.org. They are paid for courses, but they're incredible, all first aid based. I think they've got some FRET courses on there, they've got first aid courses, so really, really worth checking out if you fancy, stuffing up your portfolio a little bit. And as we have mentioned a few times tonight, Chris has mentioned them and I've mentioned them, TCAR and PCAR, so trauma care after resuscitation and paediatric care after resuscitation. They have some incredible online courses for you guys to check out. Obviously, we mentioned them as great CPD resources as well, even though if you scan the QR code that's on your screen now, there's too much to talk about when it comes to their website, because there's just so many different courses you can dive into. A lot of it is focused for nurses as well, so perfect for people who work either in resuscitation, in pediatric care, within nursing. Do scan the QR code that's on your screen now, or go to tcarprograms-uk dot is it prog .org, sorry, and then find out more about them. They do some incredible work around everywhere and online. And of course, the wonderful Galen. I really need to get rid of that double up. I don't know why I went all fancy and psychedelic on the trauma care sign there. However, Galen, again, as I'm not qualified, I'm not allowed to talk too much about the pharmaceutical side of stuff that they do. And obviously that goes against some stuff as well. So I am just going to give a huge shout out for Galen for their continued support year in, year out. They're there. They're always at our conferences. They're always bobbing in to say hello. You'll find them in all of our programs. If you want to find out more about them and the stuff they have on offer and stuff that you might use within your own practice, do scan the QR code that's on your screen now, or go to galen-pharma.com. And that is everything from us this evening. So everyone from all around the country, and indeed the UK, and of course Oregon, Portland, because I know you're in there. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Hopefully the weather does get a little bit better for everyone. As always, once I click end, it's going to end for all. So Chris, thank you very much for joining this evening, for giving us such a wonderful insight into the work that you do, the hard work that, and especially even for me, who's been close friends with the NMTNG for a long time, figuring out more about what you guys do as well. So thank you so much for the presentation and for inspiring everyone to go away and do something themselves. Everyone else, thank you for joining us. Wherever you are in the world, stay safe, look after your loved ones, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.